All right, to the word. Here's a word for you. Slavery. Oh, really? We have to talk about that? Yeah. When we hear that word, we Americans often think of the shameful institution pervasive in the American colonies and then ultimately in the United States for about 200 years, the institution of slavery. It was legal until about 1864. We think about that when we hear the word slavery. We think about the horrors of, well, quite honestly, what white people did to people of African descent, taking them forcibly from their countries, from their homelands, bringing them to the United States, and very impersonally and horribly transforming them just into working machines. Slavery. Frederick Douglass, you may remember the name from American history. He was a former slave, obviously a slave, and then was redeemed from that, and became an eloquent anti-slavery crusader. He wrote a narrative description of his life in 1845, about 15 years before the Civil War happened. And in the story that he wrote, he included some chilling descriptions of this institution of slavery. One of the descriptions that he wrote had to do with the lack of... Is this going out? I feel like it is. It's going in and out. If you can't notice, then I shouldn't have brought it up, but I'll just keep speaking. All right, so one of the descriptions Douglass had referenced the lack of beds for slaves. In fact, he wrote, there were no beds given to slaves, only a coarse blanket, and only adults got a blanket. But, he wrote, this is not a very great privation. The slaves find less difficulty from the want of beds than from the want of time to sleep. Douglass went on to write how that the few hours which slaves had away from the fields were spent preparing to go back to work in the fields the next day. Mending and washing clothes, cooking meager food, all without the necessary facilities to do so. And when this work is done, Douglass wrote, old and young, male and female, married and single, drop down side by side on one common bed, the cold, damp floor, each covering himself or herself with their miserable blankets, and here they sleep till they are summoned to the fields again by the driver's horn. And the author continued, if they did not hear the morning horn, the slaves were then awakened with a whip or a stick. What an existence. And that's exactly what it was. It wasn't life, it was an existence. Day after day. No hope for anything else. No pay, no benefits, no vacation, no sick time. Literally and figuratively, slaves were chained to a system which devoured them, which sucked the very life out of men and women, boys and girls. Thankfully, none of us here today has experienced that kind of existence. We have not experienced that kind of slavery. At least not the legal slavery that we think of when we reflect back on what this country was doing up until the middle of the 1800s. And yet, as horrible as that slavery was, I don't want to talk about that this morning. But I do want to talk about a different kind of slavery. A slavery which we have all experienced to some degree, and a slavery which vestiges of we still may experience. It's a slavery, honestly, that's bigger, that's broader, that is more pervasive than the horrible institution of slavery that characterized our country 150 years ago. What I'm talking about this morning is the slavery to sin. The slavery to sin. A slavery which even us Christians may feel like we are still a part of. You know, that habit, that bad habit, that thought, that set of words that we just can't seem to get free of. Maybe in our heart of hearts we don't want to get free of. And so for Christians, and especially for non-Christians, we may feel like pure, ultimate freedom from this kind of slavery is hard, if not impossible, to come by. Kind of like, we may be like that Alabama slave said back in 1864, upon being asked what he thought of the great emancipator and the great Emancipation Proclamation that had gone into effect that year. He said, "I don't know nothing about Abraham Lincoln, except they say he set us free, and I don't know nothing about that either." Christian, this morning, you may find yourself living day to day as if you don't know nothing about moral freedom. You've forgotten the fact that your slavery to sin no longer exists. And of course, if you're not a believer in Christ, you're still enslaved. And you're there. You know exactly what I'm talking about. So for all of us, Christians and non-Christians this morning, I want to go back to Romans 6. And I want to talk some more about grace to change. Grace which the Apostle Paul compared to and contrasted with slavery. Yeah, slavery to sin and slavery to God. A bad slavery, a good slavery. Good slavery, yeah, well, let's just see what Paul has to say this morning. Romans chapter 6. Let's go back there. Romans chapter 6, and I'd like to read a couple of verses here, verses 15 and 16. Romans 6, 15 and 16. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under law but under grace? By no means. Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone to obey him as slaves, you are slaves to the one whom you obey,